Well, if you're a guest or visitor with us this morning, I'm glad you found us and thankful that you can be with us. I'm going to do something a little different this morning. Ryan's going to put a slide up here, hopefully. So that's Neil Janke, and he passed away this week. And I put it in the weekly email, and many of you read a little memorial about him there. But for those of you that didn't get the email, I wanted you to be aware of this. Neil has been a part of our church for 5 or 6 years and comes very faithfully. And we are his family, literally. And then his place of employment also. He was a machinist for 33 years here in town. And he didn't show up for work on Monday, which was unlike him, and he didn't call in. And so his boss/owners of the company went to his house and found him, and he was deceased. He was sitting on his couch peacefully with his Bible next to him open. And so I called the employer yesterday, I guess, maybe it was Friday, and visited with him. And they were his family in many ways and are taking care of the arrangements. And they didn't know what he wanted. In fact, they'd asked him numerous times, Neil, if you pass away, what do you want us to do? And he never gave them an answer. So they decided they would cremate him and take his ashes to the Steens Mountains, which is one of his favorite places to camp and to be. So wanted you to know that. Neil's been a part of our church. We are pretty much his only family, and he's with the Lord today, and wanted to make sure we didn't just miss that. So there you go. Let's pray together. Father, thank you that we are adopted into your family, and that when we die, we actually are where we're meant to be. And the sin and the issues of this world are gone, and we're face to face with you. And as we heard this morning, and as we imagined what it might be like to be in your throne room, we're grateful that our brother Neil is enjoying his life with you. Help us to be faithful to you while we're here, and pray that you'd use your word today in our hearts and lives, and your spirit would quicken it to us, and we'd be responsive and know what it is you're calling us to do. And thank you for the connections within this family, this body. Pray that you would continue to strengthen them. You'd protect our unity. That even when we have disagreements and conflicts and, the natural courses of life, that we would choose to be a family that connects well with each other and forgives and moves forward. And help us in that sense of unity to be a demonstration to the world around us that's so disunified that we can be a light in darkness. I ask for your help now as we look into your word, grateful for all the stories we're going to cover today, and ask you use this time to bless the hearer and help me to communicate well. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, we are going to cover a number of stories today, and so you're going to have to listen fast, and I'm going to talk long, so it's going to be a perfect marriage. We're going to start in verse 31 of chapter 7. And pick up this last story, and then we'll move through a big chunk of chapter 8. So let me just read, and then we'll start. It says, "Again, he went out from the region of Tyre and came through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee within the region of Decapolis. And they brought to him one who was deaf and spoke with difficulty, and they implored him to lay hands on him. Jesus took him aside from the crowd by himself and put his fingers into his ears. And after spitting, he touched his tongue with the saliva. And he looked up to heaven with a deep sigh, and he said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was removed, and he began speaking plainly. And he gave them orders not to tell anyone, but the more he ordered them, the more widely they continued to proclaim it. And they were utterly astonished, saying, He has done all things well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." Last week, we noted that Jesus had left Galilee and moved up into Gentile territory. He'd gone up to Tyre and Sidon, which is on the Mediterranean, and it's in modern-day Lebanon, I think. And so he went to where there were no Jews to speak of, and he engaged with a Syrophoenician woman who wanted her daughter healed from a demon. Well, now, if you follow what's happening here, he travels, but in a very circuitous route. He travels all through Gentile territory to come down to the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee in a region called Decapolis, meaning 10 cities. And he stayed out of Jewish territory and remained in Gentile territory, and he comes down and he's ministering to Gentiles again today. And I think that's indicative. Historians guess, they estimate that he maybe spent 6 to 8 months in that tour that just took one verse, in ministering to Gentile people along the way. Now, his main call was to the Jews, but he was demonstrating to the disciples that someday they would answer the call and go to all parts of the world, including the Gentile world. So he comes to this area of Decapolis, and this isn't the first time we've run into Decapolis here. If you'll turn back to chapter 5 real quickly, we see it again. Chapter 5, and he heals the demoniac. Remember the man that had thousands of demons in him? They asked the demon, what's his name? And he said it was Legion, and they were cast into the swine, and a couple thousand swine ran into the sea and drowned. That guy, in verse 17, and they began to implore him to leave their region. They wanted Jesus to leave the region. And as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed was imploring him that he might accompany him. So he's saying, Jesus, can I go with you? Can I be one of your followers? And he, Jesus, did not let him, but he said, go to him. Go home to your people and report to them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he had mercy on you. Now, Jesus sort of takes two approaches, and one approach is go tell, but the more common approach is don't tell. But in this case, he says, now go and tell. And then verse 20, and he went away and began to proclaim in Decapolis what great things Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. So it appears if the person that was healed or the demon was cast out was Jewish and in Galilee or in Judea, in the Jewish realm, he often said, don't tell, because he didn't need bigger crowds. He didn't need more looky-loos. He was trying to accomplish his purpose of getting to the cross, and he recognized that he would be fighting up against political purposes if people began to follow him for the wrong reasons. But in this case, this man is from Decapolis. He was a Gentile. And he said, now go back to your homeland and tell everyone what the Son of Man has done for you. And so he really is the first missionary to the Gentile world, even though he was not one of the apostles, but he was apparently faithful and went back to Decapolis and was talking about Jesus. So when Jesus arrives a number of months, if not a year or more later, word about him has spread, and immediately people bring this man to him who is unable to hear and unable to speak. Now, the Greek would indicate that he may have had hearing early in his life, and it was lost, but he probably didn't learn how to speak at that early stage. So he has suffered his whole life of being misunderstood. First, he can't hear, which is, I'm guessing, very, very frustrating. But secondly, when he tries to speak, he can't speak. And if you've ever been around someone who has that kind of speech impediment, I hate to say this, but our first and sort of natural reaction is we assume they're not as smart as we are. And that's an absolutely wrong assumption. I'm just speaking sort of reality here. We think something must be wrong. So he's always lived a life of being looked at differently because first he can't hear and secondly he can't speak. And today he's being brought to Jesus. He's heard about Jesus because of this demon-possessed man that has come back to his hometown, his home region, and has been declaring who Jesus is. So that catches us up with the story. I spent a summer in Poland. I was doing missionary work there, and we were living in a small, remote mountain village. And we were living with families, and there were 4 of us there. And so the 2 of us guys lived with this one family, and it was a farming village. And they were a wonderful family. And I wore a great big white straw cowboy hat over to Poland. We were told, so the Iron Curtain was still going on, and we were told you can go there, but you have to look like American tourists. And for the first 10 days we were there, we were told just to be American tourists and not to give away our cover. So I thought, well, what's more American than a great big old cowboy hat? And so I wore a cowboy hat. All right, Steve. Yeah, there we go. But I've got a fairly large noggin. My cranium is about size 8.5 or something like that. And so when we got to this family's house, he was a farmer, and they didn't have tractors. He used horses, and he pulled a wagon. I mean, it was like stepping back into 18th century, you know. So I gave him my cowboy hat, and it came down to about here on him. And he took a string and tied it up, and he wore that thing so proudly. But the reason I'm telling the story is they had 5 children, all of whom were deaf. And I don't know, obviously it was some sort of genetic issue, but every one of them was deaf, and it was such a frustration for me, because first, I didn't speak Polish, and secondly, I just could not communicate with these kids. I finally did. They had a dog that was just unbelievably terrifying, and the dog's name was Ugarish. And I said, "What's Ugarish mean?" And it means bite. But it was a great big white sheep, and they raised some sheep, and they had a big, some sort of sheepy mountain dog, and it would hit the end of its chain just like this. And so I learned how to say to the kids, and they'd say, "Yeah, he's on his leash." And that was about the extent of my sign language. Well, in Jesus' day, there is no sign language, I'm assuming. It's now, I think, universalized, and it can be used across cultures. But in Jesus' day, there was no sign language, which I think gives some bearing as to how and why he healed the way he did. Because Mark gives us great detail here, and it's odd detail if you stop and think about it. So they bring this man to Jesus, and Jesus takes him away from the crowd, and he pulls him aside, and he can't speak to him, and the man can't understand him. And he puts his fingers in his ears. And I think that's sign language. I know you can't hear, and I'm going to fix your ears. And then he spits on his hand, and he reaches up and puts spittle on the man's tongue, and he says, "I'm going to give your speech back." Now, a couple things to note here. One, this is a Gentile. He's a broken Gentile, so he is unclean at 2 levels. And Jesus reaches out and touches him, which is a big no-no. And we've seen him do this over and over again, because when Jesus touches broken, unclean people, he does not become defiled, they become healed. And so he has no problem with reaching out and touching and embracing and getting personal with this guy. And it seems odd. The fingers in the ear is one thing, the spittle on the tongue is another. I don't understand it, and I don't know that we need to. But he's suggesting that I'm going to heal you. And then it says that he sighs a deep sigh. And I think he's connecting emotionally, saying, I get what you're going through. And he's saying this is a result of sin, not the man's sin. Let's be clear on that. But, our bodies fail and we die because of the sin of mankind. That was never a part of the problem. So here is this man, and he's broken, and that's as a result of sin. And Jesus is sighing deeply. And then he looks up to heaven. And he's giving credit to where credit is due, that the Father is going to, through the Son, with the power of the Holy Spirit, heal this man. And then Mark gives us both the Aramaic word, and because Mark is writing to primarily a Gentile world, then he translates it into Greek, and it's basically, be opened. And immediately, the man can hear and the man can speak. Now, if you've ever known anyone that has received like cochlear implants or has gotten help with their hearing, it takes a long time to get your speech back, because that's a learned process, and if you haven't had years in which to speak, it's a long-term process. But in Jesus' case here with this man, he instantly gets all the speech therapy he's ever going to need, and he learns to speak immediately. Now, a couple things to note. I find it ironic that he tells this man, now don't tell anyone. And what's he do? He tells everyone. You heard me say this before. He tells us, go tell everyone, and all of a sudden we're mute, and we don't tell the gospel. Neil, it was shared on the Facebook post that I made, a friend of his in his small group said that Neil was I think a lion for the gospel. He was always telling people about the gospel. And we are called to be men and women that speak about Jesus and the gospel. But in this case, he says, now don't tell people. And I'm thinking, again, his word about him has spread in this community through the original missionary that was sent there. And now he doesn't want political problems here either. He just wants to be able to minister. But this man goes and tells. In verse 37, it says, they were utterly astonished, saying, he has done all things well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. That's a beautiful phrase. He has done all things well. And Jesus has done all things well. The Father said, here's my son, I'm greatly pleased. So there's the first story. It's a Gentile in a Gentile land that Jesus gets real personal with and connects with and shows him who's going to heal him and then heals him. And the man goes out and he continues to proclaim it. So let's move to chapter 8 now. In those days, when there was again a large crowd and they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples and said to them, I feel compassion for the people because they remain here now with me for 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from a great distance. And his disciples answered him and said, where will we be able to find enough bread here in this desolate place to satisfy these people? And he was asking them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. And he directed the people to sit down on the ground, and taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks and broke them and started giving them to his disciples to serve them. And they served them to the people. They also had a few small fish, and after he had blessed them, he ordered these to be served as well. And they ate and were satisfied, and they picked up 7 large baskets full of what was left over of the broken pieces. And there were 4,000 were there, and he sent them away. And immediately he entered the boat with his disciples and came to the district of Dalmanutha. Okay, so this is the second feeding. The first feeding was of 5,000 Jews. This one's unique because it's 4,000 Gentiles. Again, it's one thing to be passing through Gentile territory. It's a whole nother thing to sit down and eat with them. That's a big no-no. And Jesus is demonstrating that he's not constrained by those kinds of laws, that he is not made impure, but he makes others pure. And he doesn't hesitate to feed them. We see again the mixture of his humanity and his divinity. In a human level, he's hungry. He knows they're hungry. They've been with him for 3 days with nothing to eat to speak of. And he says, I can't see this continuing on. We're going to have to meet this need. And so he talks to his disciples. Now, I'm going to take his interaction with his disciples. There's 2 ways to take it. I'm going to take it that it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, okay? Because they've been through this process once before. And I would suggest that verse 4, when the disciples answered him, well, first in verse 3, he says, we need to feed him. And his disciples answered and said, where will anyone be able to find enough bread here in this desolate place to satisfy these people? There's 2 ways of looking at this. One is the disciples really are quite dense and had forgotten that, oh, wait a second, Jesus fed, how do you forget that? I don't think you do. So I'm going to choose, and I don't know that there's a right or wrong here, I'm going to choose that it's sort of I wonder where you could find enough food to feed 4,000 people. And Jesus said, what have you gathered? In other words, you've already gathered the food. You know what we're going to do. And they said, well, we've got 7 loaves. And he says, okay, bring the 7 loaves here. I'd like to think that there's a give and take, a little bit of a rapport between Jesus and his disciples. We'll see them in a moment exhibit some spiritual density. But I'd like to think in this situation there's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek humor going on because they know exactly that he can provide. He is the bread of life. And he is going to meet this need just like he met the need of the 5,000 prior to this. So that's how I'm interpreting this. You could interpret it as they are very dense. And we'll find out when we talk to them in heaven which is true. But I think they're appreciating my interpretation right now, although they're not listening. Okay, so again, we see the humanity of Jesus in concern about their hunger and his own hunger. We see the divinity of Jesus in his ability to create food instantaneously. And same pattern, he takes the food, he prays to the Father, he breaks it and just continues to break and to feed. And the disciples say there were 4,000 again. This would be counting men, not women and children there. And then he sends them away. And they're satisfied. That word satisfied, again, is the same one used earlier in the book, and that means full to the brim. They could not eat anymore. There was no sense of, is there anything left? Can I get some more here? It was like, I cannot eat another bite. And again, I think this translates back into the spiritual application behind this when Jesus says, I am the bread of life. He is saying when we come to him in faith and we have a relationship with him and we've experienced being born again through the Spirit of God, through faith in Jesus, we no longer hunger for the spiritual answer. We have been fed and satisfied. Now, it doesn't mean we know all the answers. It doesn't mean we walk in complete obedience. It doesn't mean that we, in our own sin, drift away. But it does mean we know there is no other source for spiritual food. It's Jesus, and he satisfies completely. Now, some would say, well, this is just a retelling of the first story, but that's really a hard conclusion to reach to, because as we read through the chapter, Jesus will tell the first story again. He sees the 5,000 and the 4,000 as two completely separate incidents, and we now know that one was Jewish and one was Gentile, and it's again demonstrating to us that Jesus is no respecter of people. He's going to care for all, and he's going to meet their needs, and all are welcome to come to him. Okay, let's go to the next one. So immediately they enter the boat, just like last time, and they sail across the Sea of Galilee from the east to the west, and they come to this region of Dalmanutha. People don't know exactly where that is. I was thinking about that today. You know, Oregon's been a state for a couple hundred years or something like that. I don't know. It's been a state for quite a while. And yesterday I read a book about 4 baseball players, and one of the guys met his wife in Illahee, Oregon. And I thought, where is Illahee? I've lived here my whole life. Where is Illahee, Oregon? And I looked it up, and it's down on the Rogue, and it's not even a city anymore. It's sort of an unincorporated, it's like one of those little logging towns. It was, when he met her, she was a teacher at an Indian reservation. And I thought, there's probably towns in Oregon that are completely disappeared from the map. You know, Valsette's used to be a logging town. It's not there anymore. And we're only, I'll give you a couple hundred years old. You know, when you think about places that the Bible is describing, you know, it's speaking of them 2,000 years ago. And the fact that historians or archaeologists can't necessarily find these places isn't a shock, but it doesn't mean they didn't exist. So I just wanted to point that out, that no one's real certain where this is. They think it's on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. Okay, verse 11. And the Pharisees came out and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. Sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, "Why does this generation seek for a sign? Truly, I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." Leaving them, he again embarked and went away to the other side. Jesus spends a lot of time in this boat. Matthew tells us in this encounter that the Pharisees came out with the Sadducees. Now, to give us some sense of, this would be like Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi being on the same page. It's not going to happen. I mean, even over this Iran thing, they're not on the same page on that, and they're never going to be. Pharisees and Sadducees were completely divided spiritually. But here they're united. Isn't it interesting that evil can often choose to unite when it comes to facing the Son of God? When they want to do disservice to Jesus, they find they're both on the same team. And so the Pharisees and the Sadducees meet him at the shoreline, and they say, okay, you need to produce for us a sign from heaven. Now remember, they have accused him that his miracles and his teaching and preaching is from Satan himself. And so now they're saying, prove to us once and for all that you are not an impostor of Satan, but that indeed you are a prophet of God. So do a sign from heaven. Now what they mean by that is some sort of heavenly sign, and I don't know what it would be, but they're saying there needs to be something that's bigger and better than what you've already done. Now think about the audacity of this request. He has healed the blind, he's raised the dead, he's fed the 9,000 plus now. He's walked on water, he's calmed the storms, he's restored the crippled. He has done everything. And much of it they have watched. And they've watched it and reached the sick conclusion that he is working for Satan. Jesus is having no more of this. And he says it real clearly. He sighs deeply in his spirit. Can you imagine what it must feel like to be the Son of God that came to be the Messiah to save your people, and the leaders, the spiritual leaders of your people are saying you're from Satan? Show us another sign. He sighs deeply. Have you ever been misunderstood? You know that feeling of, I can't win this. They're getting this wrong. Well, that's just on a little minute scale. Jesus is being misunderstood on the eternal scale. He's being accused of being Satan's henchman. He sighs deeply in his spirit, and he says, why does this generation seek for a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. This generation, I think, is referring to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the leader at that period of time, and he's saying, you've seen enough. I'm not going to entertain this idea. I'm not going. And they're trying to trap him, of course. If he doesn't do the sign, then they can say, look, he didn't do the sign we asked for, and he's not going to enter into that game. And so he turns on his heel, gets back into the boat, and sails away. Think about what we just saw in the healing, and we've seen him heal the blind, and now these men are spiritually blind, and they're spiritually deaf. They have no ability to respond to Jesus. They have hardened their hearts to the point that Jesus literally turns on his heel, gets in the boat, and sails away. He's saying, I'm done with these men. That's spiritual blindness. That's the hardness of heart that apart from a work of God, well, it's always a work of God, these men are not going to respond, and Jesus is done giving them signs. I don't know where that hits you, how you put yourself in the equation, but there's a difference between spiritual blindness and spiritual density. And we're going to get to spiritual density here in a second, but I want you to hang on to that blindness idea that these men cannot see what's before them, and they have rejected the truth. And in that rejection, Jesus has turned and left them. Okay, so leaving them, he again embarked and went away to the other side. Verse 14, and they had forgotten to take bread and did not have more than one loaf in the boat with them. And he was giving orders to them, saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they began to discuss one another the fact that they had no bread. This would be the spiritual density. And Jesus was aware of this, and he said to them, why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up? They said to him, 12. He says, when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up? And they said 7. And he was saying to them, do you not yet understand? So we see there are 2 definite miracles of the feeding. Jesus is real clear on that. So anytime you read a commentator that says this is the same story repeated, it's like they didn't read the rest of the chapter. But what we see here is a spiritual density. These men, these apostles, are in the boat. They're sailing back. They look, oh, we only have one loaf of bread. He's mentioned leaven, and that's gotten them thinking about bread. And they've gone down the wrong track completely, and he needs to bring them back. But let's look at what he says. He says, beware, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Now, biblically, most of the time, leaven is a negative thing in Scripture. Leavening, as you know, it's a yeast, and it's put in bread, and it causes bread to rise. It has a far greater influence than its own size, so to speak. And Jews primarily ate unleavened bread, especially during the Passover, so they ate flat breads that were never risen, and there was a reason for that, and I think it's so that when Jesus uses these illustrations, that's part of the reason, they can understand, okay, that's leaven is most of the time predicted as evil, or presumed as evil, and it sure is today. And he's saying, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. What is the leaven of the Pharisees? It's poor theology. It's false teaching. The Pharisees have completely misunderstood the Scriptures. They've completely misunderstood who Jesus is. They are spouting and purporting things that are untrue, and he's telling them, this is not going to go away. These men are going to continue to do this, and you need to beware of their leavening, because all it takes is just a little, and it's going to have a large influence. It's going to rise the loaf of bread, since we're talking about bread. And he says, you beware of their leaven, and you beware of the leaven of Herod. I would presume the leaven of Herod would be that of power. Herod wasn't terribly concerned about spiritual things, but he was quite concerned about material things. And so it could be the leavening of materialism, the leavening of power. And he's saying, you beware of these two things. Now, I want to make sure that we're clear on this. As hard as I try, I'd like to think that everything that I say from the pulpit is correct and accurate. But I'm guessing from time to time I make a misstatement. I might even hold a view that's not right. It's even hard for me to say that. But that's different than being spiritual leavening, holding poor theology, teaching poor theology. It's the difference between, I can debate with a Presbyterian brother on a mode of baptism. Should believers be immersed, or should infants be sprinkled? I don't think that's a life or death doctrine. I'm obviously right on that. But it's a important teaching, but it's not essential to faith, because he's not suggesting, I don't believe, that they're being saved at that point. But when you talk about the gospel, what makes up the gospel? You talk about the nature and character of God, the triune nature of God, the truth of God's revelation to mankind, the sinlessness of Jesus, the completeness of the atoning work on the cross, the sin nature of man, the lostness of man, the reality of hell, the reality of God's judgment over man. These are issues you can't trifle with. And they're the very issues that the Pharisees and scribes are poking at. So he's saying, beware. Don't get caught up in that kind of stuff. How that translates for me in our day and age is, I think it's important that we as followers of Jesus be very careful as to who we listen to. We live in a society right now, in a culture where you can get excellent teaching on the radio, podcasts, read books, and not on TV. Excellent teaching, but you can also get some very, very dangerous teaching. Be careful who you listen to. There are certain types that sort of like to poke you in the spiritual eye to get you to think, and often they do that by getting right up to the edge and sometimes stepping over the edge of good doctrine. And if we step over the edge with them in areas that matter, we can unwittingly become confused, and we can unwittingly begin to teach false doctrine that can lead people to a Christless eternity. And I would suggest just stay away from it. Just back away completely. If you've been given warnings that this person or this person is not really solid in everything they teach, don't listen to them. The risk is too high. I was thinking about this week. I love peanut M&Ms. And on occasion, there'll be a big bag of them around the office that's left over from an outing or something. And I love to be popping peanut M&Ms all day long. That's how I keep this chiseled figure. But if there was an unopened bag of peanut M&Ms in the office, and I'm on my computer and a news flash comes by from Mars Corporation, whoever makes M&Ms, and says, "We have learned that it appears there's one deadly M&M in every bag." Would you open the bag and eat it? I mean, your odds are pretty good. Do you eat them all and leave one, or how do you do this, Would you feed them to your children? Absolutely not. Until they proved that they had cleared the shelves of the deadly peanut M&Ms, I'd never eat an M&M again. If 85%, 90% of what a person teaches is good, but some of it is not right, would you pick and choose hoping you get this stuff right? I would not. So my suggestion for us is to heed Jesus' words. He warns them. He says, don't listen to the leaven of the Pharisees or the leaven of Herod. So I'm going to ask you to self-evaluate a little bit. Are you listening to things that you ought not to be listening? Are you reading things that could be dangerous? Now, I am not suggesting we live with complete blinders on, but I am saying in areas where you're in the formative stages of your thinking, I would be very, very careful what you read and who you listen to. Because false teaching is false teaching, whether it comes from a Pharisee or from a pastor or from a blogger. It doesn't really matter. Now, the leaven of Herod, I would suggest that's a big issue for us as well. It's this materialism and its power. It's the here and now. And many of us subscribe to that. We invest in it. We know we shouldn't, but we do. And Jesus is saying, I'm warning you, do not allow the leaven of Herod to get into the loaf of your heart, because it's going to cause big problems. So, first we see spiritual blindness in the Pharisees. And now we see spiritual density in the disciples. He's teaching them about leaven. The first thing that pops to their mind is bread, and they're talking about where we're going to find bread, and Jesus is going, can you not get this? I just fed 4,000 people, and before that I fed 5,000, and there's food left over. I am the bread of life. I will meet your needs. I will care for you, both physically and spiritually. And then he says, do you not yet understand? I'd like to sort of sum this up this way. The Pharisees and the Sadducees had turned from Jesus, and he turned from them as well, but they had long earlier turned from him, and they were walking away from him. They were not walking toward him. They were trying to disprove him. They were accusing him. They did not believe in him. They don't have faith in him. They're plotting plans to kill him. Okay, that's spiritual blindness. The disciples, on the other hand, turn toward him, and they're trying to follow him. And they have placed their faith in him. They have given up their homes and their jobs and their families, and they are walking with him. They are not fully understanding everything that he's calling them to do, but they are in pursuit of him. So spiritual blindness is walking away from Jesus. Spiritual density can happen on the path toward Jesus. And that's a good way to look at sin. If someone is claiming to be within the body of Christ and saying, I know the scriptures say this, but I don't like that, so I'm going to walk away from that, and I'm going to choose to live a different kind of life. So I'm going to make different choices. That is way different than saying, I am stuck in bondage to sin, but I want to walk toward Jesus and give these things to him, and hopefully I can sort this out, and hopefully he can deal with me, and he can set me free from the bondage of sin. Those are two differing tacks and differing approaches. One, I think, is the indication of spiritual blindness. I'm walking away from Jesus. The other is saying, I don't know what I'm doing all the time. I don't get everything, but I'm walking toward Jesus. And I love that the disciples set this example for us. I mean, I'm sure they're rolling their eyes from time to time going, oh man, we were knuckleheads. But we get to see here that these men are walking toward Jesus despite the fact they don't have all the answers. They're still confused. They're still thinking on earthly levels, not on spiritual levels. They're still letting the flesh dictate their decisions. We get all that because, gentlemen, men and women, that is us, is it not? The question I'd want to ask this morning is, which direction are you walking? If you're walking away from Jesus, even in the church, it happens all the time. If we're saying, no, I want to pursue this stuff, and I know I'm just going to ignore that, and I'm going to head this direction, that's a dangerous place to be walking. You're listening to the leaven of the Pharisees. But if you're walking toward Jesus with a sense of, I want to follow, I want to do this better, I want to understand more, I want to know my Bible, there are parts I sure don't get, but I'm trying, we're in really good company. We are doing what Jesus wants us to do. Follow him. We're not going to do it perfectly. We're not going to understand it all, but we are following him. Spiritual density can be healed. Spiritual blindness is eternal. And know which path you're on. It's vitally important. Let's pray. Father, for these stories, we're reminded that you, Jesus, are intimately involved with the people around you. You touch the deaf man, you feed the Gentiles, you teach the disciples, you scold them, you help get their attention. You are day to day, moment by moment, addressing things. Then you tell us that when you leave, it's better for us because you'll send your Spirit. And the teacher, the helper, the comforter indwells us. And day by day, moment by moment, you're teaching and correcting and scolding and drawing and helping. And help us to cooperate because we want to be men and women that are following after you. Protect us from the leaven of Pharisaical teaching. Protect us from poor theology and false doctrine. Protect us from anything that would harm our walk with you. And keep us pursuing after you. We are so thankful for your kindness and grace and mercy when we fail, when we don't understand, when we can't comprehend. We're just thankful to have a Father that loves his children and calls us to follow. Help us to do that well.